Right now, Tim Pool is trending on Twitter because I said y'all are in a civil war. Did a long segment about it for 1 p.m. talking about what we're currently facing, and I go quite in depth on what I mean by civil war. There is a multi-generational theory of warfare, first, second, third, fourth, fifth. Boy, there could be sixth. Fifth generation warfare typically is psychological operations, manipulation, and easiest way to describe it is that. I would say this. Back in the day when communication was limited, you could go to a village and you would say, "We hereby, on the name of the king, tell you to submit." You try to tell them that you are now going to fall into the crown, submit to his whims, and they would say, "Over our dead bodies." In order to gain access to this land, its resources, and its people, you would then engage in physical subjugation and oppression. Hey, war would break out. Famously with Sparta and was it Xerxes, Persia? He says to hand over your weapons, and they said, "Come and take them." But what happens when you control communications? Now with the mass communication system, social media or otherwise, you don't need to fight anybody to get them to submit. You need only twist their minds through the control of media. That's fifth generational warfare. Brian Krasenstein disagrees with me. He's wrong. And I will address this and the comments people have made and talk about this concept. Krasenstein says America is not in a civil war. We're not even close. Yes, we are divided as a nation, but we are a nation of laws, a nation that values the separation of powers, and a nation with strong judicial systems. No, Brian, I believe, is just being contrarian. We just had lawyers get arrested, dude. It's never happened before. He says, I don't agree with Tim Pool here. Division over the Georgia 2020 election indictment does not equate to anything close to war, and the concern that such is even a remote possibility in my mind is much, much too pessimistic. Americans in general are good, kind, understanding people. We don't seek to harm each other because of political differences or because a fourth grand jury decided to hand up yet another indictment, blah, 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 blah. How about this one from the post-millennial? 30 million Americans say violence is justified to keep Trump from power. Use Chicago study. I'll give a better headline to the post-millennial. Study says 30 million Americans think violence is justified. 30 million Americans didn't say this. A study of 3,500 people was done, and they found that around 11.6% of those surveyed believe violence was justified. I want to address this because I really want to dig in the core of what I think people are missing in any kind of discussion about civil war. He goes on to say, most of the people here on X who are arguing over the Trump indictment would be cordial to one another in real life. Words on social media do not equate to hate towards one another. Stop allowing the media and social media to make you think otherwise. We need to stop using harmful rhetoric and allow the independent judicial system to settle these cases. And then he posts a photo of people with a fake gallows in front of the Capitol building on January 6th. Give us liberty or death is one of the flags in the photos. Okay. Well, let's talk about it. The first response most people bring up is how many people fought in the American Revolution? 3%, they say. It's actually between 3 and 10%, probably not 3%. But even 10% is very, very low. If we're seeing that a study shows 11.6% of people hold sentiments that violence is justified to keep Trump out of power, and among Republicans, about 6%, that means, ladies and gentlemen, we are looking at, let's just do the math. Some 45 to 50 million people in this country believe that violence is justified in some way or another. Now, the left has the monopoly here, 2-1 against conservatives. What do you think that means? When I say civil war, I often clarify to say that this could be a higher evolution, a further generation of what civil war could be or what is. That is to say, it's psychological manipulation. But I do think it's fair to say we are rapidly approaching very real civil war. When the GOP has a meeting, which I pointed out in the 1 p.m. segment, and they say that civil war is coming because they're arresting alternate electors. This is the constitutional process by which you challenge an election. The alternate electors fill out the paperwork, a court proceeding ensues, a judge issues a ruling, and if the ruling is confirmed, those alternate electors are certified. If the judge rules otherwise, nothing happens. For this reason, they are trying to arrest Republicans. Okay, maybe Brian's right. It's not a civil war because Republicans are doing quite literally nothing as innocent people are being imprisoned for doing quite literally nothing. Sure. Here's some of the responses. Misha Fitton, a subscriber to me on Twitter, I appreciate it, says, I think the Civil War rhetoric is wrong. There are ways to protest peacefully in an upcoming election. Violence should be avoided. I completely agree. I understand there can be an argument that we are in a cold civil war, but I disagree with that as well. I think we're in a battle of political brinksmanship. I don't know what that means. Brian says, Americans always think things are worse than they really are. We are not headed towards a civil war. We're not even close to such a thing. There is too much at stake for everybody to go to war with one another. It's fascinating. Maybe he's right. I'm not saying I know everything. All I can tell you is that I've repeatedly said, hey, I think this will lead to escalation, and the escalation has occurred. We've seen many people who have studied history, more so than I've barely studied it, have pointed out the similarities between, say, the Spanish Civil War, the Bolshevik Revolution, Weimar Germany, or even the American Civil War. A few years ago, a Trump supporter was walking down the street when a far left extremist walked up to him and put 2 bullets in his chest. We had the story of there's a man recently convicted driving an Uber in Austin, I believe, when a far left extremist came up to him with a rifle at low ready. So, fearing for his life, he opened fire, killing this man. Now he's going to jail. People are dying already. Fights are already happening in the streets, and far left extremists tried to burn down the White House with the president inside of it. He was forced into an emergency bunker. They firebombed a guard post on the White House grounds and set fire to the church across the street. But we're nowhere near a civil war, says Brian Krasenstein. Misha Fitton responds, I agree. I do worry about lone wolves, but that is a threat that will exist in any society. But the average American street, it's not like social media and the media describe. People aren't preparing for war, at least round where I live. It's the most frustrating thing. It's what everyone says to me every single time. The first battle of Bull Run. Let me pull that up. First battle. I'm sure there are a lot of people who disagree with me and think I'm wrong, and I'm not going to pretend to know everything about everything. Let me read this for you. The first Battle of Bull Run, called the Battle of First Manassas by Confederate forces, was the first major battle of the American Civil War. The battle was fought on July 21st, 1861 in Prince William County, Virginia, just north of Manassas, and about 30 miles west-southwest of Washington, D.C. The Union Army was slow in positioning themselves, allowing Confederate reinforcements time to arrive by rail. Each side had about 18,000 poorly trained and poorly led troops. The battle was a Confederate victory and was followed by a disorganized post-battle retreat of the Union forces. Just months after the start of the war at Fort Sumter, the Northern Republic clamored for a march against the Confederate capital on Richmond, Virginia, which was expected to bring an early end to the Confederacy. Yielding to political pressure, Brigadier General Irvin McDowell led his unseasoned Union Army across Bull Run against the equally inexperienced Confederate Army of Brigadier General P.G.T. Beauregard, whose forces were camped near Manassas Junction. McDowell's ambitious plan for a surprise flank attack on the Confederate left was poorly executed. Nevertheless, the Confederates, who had been planning to attack the Union left flank, found themselves at an initial disadvantage. Confederate reinforcements under Brigadier General Joseph E. Johnston arrived from the Shenandoah Valley by railroad, and the course of the battle quickly changed. A brigade of Virginians under a relatively unknown Brigadier General from the Virginia Military Institute, Thomas J. Jackson, stood its ground, which resulted in Jackson receiving his famous nickname Stonewall. The Confederates launched a strong counterattack, and as the Union troops began withdrawing under fire, many panicked, and the retreat turned into a rout. McDowell's men frantically ran without order in the direction of Washington, D.C. Both armies were sobered by the fierce fighting and the many casualties and realized the new war was going to be much longer and bloodier than either had anticipated. The first Battle of Bull Run highlighted many of the problems and deficiencies that were typical in the first year of the war. Unions were committed piecemeal. Attacks were frontal. Infantry failed to protect exposed artillery, etc., etc., etc. Now, they say here that both armies realized it was going to be a much bigger fight. Yeah, I don't believe that's correct, but far be it from me to question the academic source. I've watched a few documentaries and I've read a few academic papers. Far be it from me to claim to be an academic expert. But I read something interesting. The Confederates won, but they did not march on Washington, D.C. Why? They thought it was over. That's what I think is interesting here. When they said both armies sobered up and realized it was going to be a much longer and bloodier than either had anticipated. If that statement were true, wouldn't the Confederates have simply marched forward and taken Washington, D.C.? They didn't, because they didn't think that the fight was going to be long. It's remarkable to me that the history of this battle was that people were picnicking and never thought fighting would actually break out. But you know what? I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong. All I can tell you is that every step of the way, with every statement made, people keep saying we are not in or headed towards a civil war, despite this image. Now, you can argue the left has done similar things quite some time. Give me liberty or give me death. It's a famous statement. Trump, make America great again, bringing a gallows to the Capitol. It's a fake gallows, by the way. That ain't holding up any human weight. The point is, it's fascinating to me. Frogs in a pot boiling, not realizing how things are escalating. You would never. It's so fascinating. Brian Krasenstein, let's go back in time to when he was running, was it a Bieber fan account or something? Let's go back to 2016. Trump gets elected. I then say to you, by 2020, 800 people will storm their way into the Capitol. They will shut down the Electoral College proceedings. A few years later, Donald Trump and his lawyers will be criminally charged under RICO for conspiracy. Trump will be facing hundreds of years in prison. There will be violence in the streets. Someone will set fire to the church in front of the White House. The guard post will be burned down. Extremists will tear down the barricades. You'd be like, oh, shut up. You know how I know they'd say shut up? Because they told me to shut up. So all I'll say is this. Make your arguments. Fine. I'm not psychic. Okay? That's all I can say. Is that 6 years ago, I'm like, hey, this is going in a bad direction. And they went, nah, it'll be fine. It'll never get this far. Don't mistake kindness for weakness, one says. One person says, or what if we are in a civil war, except it's being waged online instead of on a physical battlefield? That's what it feels like to me. Krasenstein says, but is that actually considered a war? Words and memes are a lot different than guns and bombs. Because Brian Krasenstein, like many others, hasn't read about generational warfare and the purpose of war and what it seeks to execute. So my point is this. Typically, when I come to the argument about civil war, people often say, I've not read anything about civil war. I've only ever read about state versus state. I've never read about Spain or Russia, revolutions, or Weimar Germany, or South America, the rotation of power. And I'm not pretending to be an expert. I'm just saying, man, I've done some cursory Google searches. And I can tell you, we're tracking. And I was looking at this stuff in 2018, the Spanish Civil War, watched documentaries on the Spanish Civil War, what the communists had been doing before the military stepped in. It's crazy. But I'm not gonna go on too long with this one. That will be my response. To put it simply, if you have not done a cursory glance at what ignites civil war and the sentiments around it, then spare me the most people don't want to fight. Because my simple answer is, in every single conflict, the overwhelming majority did not fight. I mean, I guess maybe Sparta or whatever. Typically, it is a small group of individuals who engage in the fighting. And most people don't want to be involved. So we'll see. I'll leave it there. We'll go in more in depth, I suppose, tonight. YouTube.com/TimcastIRL tonight at 8 p.m. We'll see y'all there. Thanks for hanging out.